This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us again Dr. Buck Melton. Welcome, Buck. We've had lots of interchanges in the past. We've talked about a lot of things. Maybe tonight we can have a rather far-out conversation about what it would be like to live 1,000 years ago and what kind of changes have happened to our species in the past 1,000 years. What would be some of the impacts if a person, a time traveler, arrives from 1,000 years ago? What would the time traveler think, and could he have anticipated the changes that have happened? And for the sake of our conversation, many people have come from different parts of the world, different continents, so there are all kinds of different situations. But maybe we could go back 1,000 years in England. I mean, we both have English ancestors somewhere, some hazy ones back there. Who can say where everyone came from? There's probably a good mixture of everything in there. But England, in the year 1016, someone is transported from a village in the thatched roofs to Macon, Georgia, and they appear kind of like a Connecticut Yankee at King Arthur's Court, the reverse of that, a time traveler. And what would be some of the things that would strike that time traveler as he appeared? What would be some of the issues? And maybe you can comment on it. I'll throw you the ball. Go ahead.
Where to begin there? The technology, society, religion. I will say, in the year 1016, you've just survived. The thing that comes to mind immediately, since we're talking not just a millennium, but the millennium.
Yes.
That you have just come through a time when you have thought that the world might be coming to an end. As you came down from the late 990s to the year 1000, or perhaps the year 1001. It's debatable. A lot of people were thinking that this was when the second coming was going to occur.
Yes.
So you've probably still got people in 1016 who are thinking, wow, so what do we do now? Will it be in the year 2000 or the year 2001? So that would be my first thought. The second thought is that, and this is an actual example that I give in my own classes a good bit about the impact of the Industrial Revolution, which of course came many hundred years later, that if you took Benjamin Franklin, longtime resident of Philadelphia, and if you took him from 1790 and put him in a time machine and sent him back in time around 2,500 years to ancient Greece, different continent, different language, different religion, different culture, he would probably feel more at home in ancient Greece 2,500 years earlier than if you took him in his own town of Philadelphia 100 years later to 1890 and all of the vast changes that the Industrial Revolution had caused. So I think a lot of it is just getting it, technologically at least, getting back that first couple of hundred years. That people in the year 1016 probably lived in very similar ways to the year 1516 or even perhaps 1816.
So or you could say 1855. I mean, or maybe getting there. But this extraordinary change that's taken place. So for a couple of hundred years, not too much difference. But there's been this extraordinary exponential change in the last century or two. The rocket ship is taking off. But just to continue, 1016, okay, pretty much this person is going to be speaking Anglo-Saxon. So a question I'll ask is...
Not in Anglo-Saxon, I hope.
What? No, I won't. I won't mention an Anglo-Saxon. But is that a burden to people? In other words, is English going to... The fact we've got this language that can describe the world better than some tongue. So is it, just to ask this question, are some societies held back because their language, their very inflected language, or the value that words have is that going to cause issues about understanding truth or knowing what the deal is? Some people would say, well, you've got our pronouns have gender attached to them, and that's going to have some kind of impact. And Chinese their pronouns do not have gender. So the subtle ways that language impacts things is our language English. It's a combination of several different, I guess, tongues, if you want to say it that way. It's got some Anglo-Saxon, some Old French in it. It's got some Latin. It's got any comments?
Well, I do think you bring up an interesting point, because I was starting to think of some African languages that don't have conditionals in them.
Yes.
So I never really thought you. So you've really achieved surprise with this one. But I think you can probably see a Darwinistic competition among languages, and a language that is going to serve the needs of society will probably survive and prosper. Of course, that brings up the question of, what are the needs of society? Is it technological progression? Is it a way of thinking of new models, new paradigms?
Yes.
Or is it to preserve? Is it to keep social traditions or governmental traditions in place? That's one reason that attorneys, even today, still use a heavy amount of what is called law Latin, or sometimes law French, but especially law Latin, because if you've got a legal concept and it's an established legal concept, then you want to describe it in words of a language that is dead, of a language that does not evolve. Because if the language evolves, then the meaning that you are trying to keep stable and unchanging may evolve as well. So, for instance, just to take one example, the phrase fee simple.
Yes.
It goes back close to 1,000 years, and it doesn't change because we've got that concept nailed down. We want to keep it nailed down, and so we're going to keep using that phrase.
Well, that's a good point. I'll say that's something for me to brood about. Well, what I'm getting into is, if you read Beowulf, it's a very poetic language. The descriptions are really, they cut to the chase a lot.
Much more German sounding than
right.
we would think English.
But the takeaway message is, maybe this language, with all its poetry, it's going to have to be a little difficult to describe. So you're walking around, it'll be a little difficult to describe what you see when you walk around. So maybe that's an issue.
The color blue. I'm sorry to interrupt, but if you look at most writings, blue, of all the colors, enters the lexicon much later than any of the other colors. Regardless of language.
I don't want to get too much off the subject, but you could say one of the scholars have looked into this, and the Homer never used the word blue. The wine dark sea. The question is, why was blue? It's a worthy of great attention. But let us move on. Let's move on.
Indeed.
So we're in the Anglo-Saxon village. The other thing that's out there is, if the person had appeared here, presumably that person would have been marred by all kinds of personal tragedies. So we'll assume it's a male. We'll say you're about 40, right, Bucky? But we'll say, all right, we'll say this gentleman's 50. He's considered very old. He's an ancient 50-year-old guy. He's an old person, and he said all kinds of terrible things happened to him. If he's a guy, because of the dangers of childbirth, if he's 50, maybe he's had several wives that have died. It's so dangerous in that state of nature to go through childbirth.
He's the sole survivor of 8 siblings.
Right, and many children have died. So he's just been scarred and hurt by death and just suffering, and so he's really inured to pain, maybe psychological pain.
Skin cancers, half his teeth gone.
Right, well so we could say just the experience of that. The other point that's out there, first he'd be considered really old. He would have been injured a lot, and walking around, I would imagine one of the things that would strike him would be, boy, look at all these people. They've never really been hurt the way that I've been hurt.
Yes.
Nobody's lost 10 children. Nobody's been through that injury. And then the health story is that dental care really went down south when it went terribly bad with the onset of sugar. Or maybe it was a little early for that. Maybe the teeth were still there. Good question, but if any problem occurred, it was just that was it. I mean,
Deadly, yes.
You have any kind of difficulty, any kind of infection, any just wear and tear. We don't really consider being injured by infections or germs or whatever. Terrific difficulties. Scurvy
Yes.
would have been there, and he might have lost all the teeth just referable to scurvy. Bad vitamins and any little impediment would have been devastating.
He's shorter, he's smaller, he's frailer. What happens to his cognitive development due to inferior diet? And even with good cognitive development, he's probably illiterate.
Well, let's go through that. So what we've said is maybe the language is going to be an issue, the ability to understand what's happening. Secondly, very substantial psychological injuries. Then we have health injuries. And the other thing would be, in our modern world, we can digest facts with some rapidity, I think. We're wired up to the world. So facts are coming into us from every side, and we're used to change. We're used to this happening, that happening, this happening. But in a way, I'm not saying change would not exist in, say, an English village. Mainly, it would be sort of secondarily human change, but the environment would cause any bad windstorm would be horrific. The crops could fail. So he would be really a victim of the environment. Really interested in the way the sun sets, whether it's cold out or not. Every little detail.
Well, let's bring in now some technology and well as some knowledge that there's no way that he can see the storm coming. There's no meteorology. There's no Doppler radar. There is no way for one village, even 10 miles away, to rapidly transmit information. My gosh, this storm's coming. Get your cattle, get the crops in, whatever. And which leads to a sense of being more at the mercy of God or nature or the spirits or the elements. That when Christ commands the storm on the Sea of Galilee to peace be still, the ancients viewed that as an orderly God imposing order on chaos. Today we would view that as a chaotic element being introduced. Well, we know why the storm is there. It'll play itself out. We can predict it. And then all of a sudden, here's the black swan that comes in and stops it.
Yes.
So completely opposite.
Well, I think we're sort of getting in there. We're sort of going in some direction here about how a person would basically come to grips. This small, frail, sickly person would arrive who had been psychologically injured. And the other thing I would say is we'll get into the illiteracy. The fact that the person would not be numerate, would not be accustomed to dealing with numbers. We had Roman numerals if you guide anything. So just the importance of numbers, understanding of this 12 and 6 and 20 and 90 and a million and whatever.
Have you ever tried dividing 127 by 38 in Roman numerals?
Pretty tough, isn't it? It's tough in Arabic.
Yes.
Well, there would be a lot of problems with language. Also, a relatively restricted vocabulary. So the people there I don't know how many words we commonly use, 50,000 or access to thousands of words. Very few words, inflected words, limited vocabulary, not numerate. And what we get into is a total inability to understand causality. Very little knowledge of causality as to why things go up or why things go down. And we have a sense, as you mentioned, about the sort of the world order and understanding what makes things happen, and then trying to manipulate things because we understand causality. But in those circumstances, we'd really have to depend on God's will. I mean, that would come down to it. If something happens, it would be totally out of this person's control. And in some ways, in order to influence that, the idea of religion would be extraordinarily important. But there was sort of he would try and tithe. There would be sort of a contract with God, as much as there could be one, is that I'll do this, I'll do what you request, and please get me to heaven or cure my illness. So that would be a person coming to Macon, Georgia with those viewpoints, I think would just be astounded by the absence of religious overview here. And using the words God's will would be, we rarely hear that, we do some, but it would be substantially missing from.
It's largely been shunted into the nooks and crannies that science can't explain. We leave to God.
Yes.
This brings up a couple of interesting points. The first point would be, and I just want to mention this as an aside, are you aware of James Burke, an English, I guess you'd call him a telejournalist, and back in the 70s and 80s, he had a fascinating series on BBC, I believe it was, called The Day the Universe Changed.
I vaguely remember
I would
that.
really commend that too,
Yeah,
because it talks about
Sudden
how
events.
civilization and the human perception of the universe changes based on just the discovery of one new idea,
Yes,
one new thought,
right.
the idea of credit or the idea of perspective in
right,
art,
yes.
or germ theory, which ties in very well here. The other one is, I'd like to ask you that if you look all the way back to the historian Thucydides, his premise is, and this is one that I tend to believe, that technology changes, society changes, government changes, everything changes except this thing that we call human nature.
Yes.
But if you change the physical surroundings of the brain, the nutrition it's getting,
Yes.
the psychological experiences it's undergoing, then can you argue that human nature itself does in fact change?
Well, what you get, I mean, I want to get so much off the subject, but I think it's pertinent to our discussion, is the idea that the Neo-Palladium, so the brain is really several parts to it, and the higher part, which is our rational part, I think it can be strengthened. And the sort of basic rhinoencephalon, our nature of, I don't know, animalistic nature, that remains very hardwired. So I think it is possible to have societies that are more rational, more avuncular, more collaborative. They're sort of a better place. So I think it is possible to change human behavior to some degree, and also socialization plays a role. And so I think it is possible, but we can take that comment to our 1,000-year-old gentleman that's with us, and he probably, we have all these differences, but he would understand bad behavior possibly. He would understand what happens. I mean, it was a violent time, and bad people cut other people's throats. They assaulted ladies. They did, all kinds of terror. They were doing all kinds of bad things, and the limits on bad behavior were probably not so extraordinary. I'm making a big statement
Yes.
here, but the power of law was not what it is now. So outlaws were out there. Vikings raided things. If the local duke wanted to do something, pretty much there was their rights and restraints that maintained the common man. I don't think were as present. Maybe some feudalistic. There was something in common law that gave him some
Yes.
hope, but it was. He would have been much more at the mercy, besides weather, besides everything else, on these bad guys that were around.
Yes, and if the law did get hold of you, its punishments were probably much more severe as well. So, although the common law did not exist in 1016, not for another
Really?
100+ years. So.
Is that right? I have
Yes.
to think about that. But
The common law, well, you had the idea of custom going all the way
Right,
back
right.
to the ancient
Maybe it's the
Germanic societies,
terminology,
the
yeah.
Wehrgild, for instance.
right, yeah.
But yeah, the common law didn't really start coming in until Henry II in the mid 1100s. You didn't even have French in place in England in 1016, not for
I know
another
that.
50
Well-
years. So.
Well, even Old French then, whatever, right.
Yes.
So just to talk about this, so all right, there's our gentleman here. He's got all of these defects, and he's trying to figure out what's going on here. And the sense of this would be sort of like, I think the first impulse would be to say, I've arrived in heaven. This is heaven. Look at all the people. They live a long time. They have food. They have light, the sun, they can fly around. It's the miracle. This is what heaven must be like. Yet he would still he would be befuddled by what had occurred. And in some ways, his religious orientation would be really injured by seeing the secular world out there. He would have maybe some ambivalence about what was going on here.
Yes.
Where was the religious gravity, the sense of, you could say, the dogma in its best Catholic
Yes.
sense?
Yeah, you don't really see what you might call Christian humanism emerging until the 1400s. There may have
Yes.
been glimmers of it as early as the 1100s, but not until the 1400s a greater sense of optimism that we can shape our environment to a greater degree. And so maybe Christianity is not all about just getting through this life in order to get to the next one. And so you see Christian humanists such as Erasmus or
Yes.
St. Thomas More,
Right.
which I think fairly fundamentally
It's a
changes how
16th century kind of thing.
how most people who profess to be Christian live their Christianity.
Well, all right. So our time traveler arrives here. He's befuddled. He's all these difficulties. Do you think he would be a nice person, particularly? I mean, he's suddenly thrown into this situation. I mean, it's past his comprehension about what happened. Would he be grateful, or would he be sort of like sometimes when people have been held down and they suddenly get the crown, they act in a bad way? How well would this guy respond to? Would he sort of try and steal your shoes, or
Well,
I don't know? He'd be mad at you. You weren't going to church. I mean, what would be his response?
This goes back to your fundamental question earlier or my fundamental question of human nature changing. Cowardice. I don't think you'd find any civilization on earth that would say cowardice is a bad thing, but cowardice can be expressed in different ways. If you're in the Pacific in World War II, it may be cowardly to commit suicide rather than be captured.
Yes.
Or it may be cowardly to be captured rather than commit suicide or throw yourself on a hand grenade.
Right.
So would his sense of cowardice or honor or duty or religious devotion or whatever, would it be so culturally conditioned by where he had come from that he cannot fit into the new conditions?
Well, it might have been a stressful thing. We could talk about gender issues. So for sure, this guy was, pretty much for sure, would be a male chauvinist pig. I mean, he would have, the gender situation would be difficult. And also the notion of, I guess I could say this, the democratic system that we have, I don't know how he would respond to that. They had, I guess the Western Germanic people had their, what's it called in Iceland? But people got together and talked things over. Villages did that. I don't know how he would respond to the way decisions are made. Would he feel comfortable? The big dogs don't run things. We have all this power. How would he respond to that?
Well, if you consider that, and I know if you're like me, you see things radically changed since the time of our youth, and you have trouble adapting to some of them. I
Sure.
certainly do. And I prefer things to have been the way they were in some regards. I mean, do I like my cell phones? Yes. Do I like the internet?
Right.
Yes. But they're, I'm sorry, 80s music is 80s music, and I like it, and everything that came after that's no good. And if we are having, well, not trouble adapting, but we'd rather not adapt in these small regards just over the course of 20 or 30 years, could this person even be able to adapt in such a sharp difference as that?
Well, okay, now, Bucky, I'm going to spring the trap. So if this is how this person responded after the 1,000 years, what happens if we travel in the future 1,000 years? How would we respond to that? And mightn't it be kind of an unpleasant experience for us? I mean, are we going to encounter, we don't know, but maybe, we're going to encounter super creatures 1,000 years in the future. We show up there, they live to be 800 years old, they're in perfect health, they could do what they can, I don't know, maybe been genetically engineered to have wings, and they fly around, and they're on Mars, and they do all kinds of things that are extraordinary, and yet there might be some, their superiority would be so overwhelming, maybe is the operative word here, and maybe their viewpoints would be just antithetical to our human values, that it would be a distressing journey. What do you think here? Any thoughts about it?
Yes.
Are we be the same as the Anglo-Saxon peasant?
I think we have one or two advantages over our Anglo-Saxon peasant, but one of them may turn out to be not an advantage at all. We may just think we have it. What is the definition of science? Science is magic that works. Mm-hmm. And we know enough now about the scientific method that if you just read speculative fiction and science fiction, we can imagine all not just technological development, but social development based on these technological developments. That there's already this speculation now that we could probably say, oh, we've just found new applications of science. Now, how will the world look 1,000 years from now? We can't predict that because a lot will be socially and culturally determined. But maybe we don't have that down. We think we know what science is now. We think we've got general relativity and special relativity and quantum theory down, but maybe there's something else out there beyond quantum mechanics that will render quantum theory just as antiquated as our modern science renders his view of the world in 1016.
Well, we
can't even imagine.
Well, just to continue with this, I mean, I think I'm trying to think Brave New Worlds, whatever, the person arrives, and actually it's such a terrible experience. Even though all these wonders are out there, it's so assaultive, the changes that have happened, that, people just say, well, I'll hang myself, I can't handle this. So you could imagine a situation 1,000 years from now, maybe human reproduction is gone with the test tube. Everything is hatching out in test tubes. I don't know. Maybe there's cross species. We have all kinds of strange species that are out. All kinds of things that would just be. Have we really entered heaven, or is this some kind of just terrible way that the species have evolved that doesn't comport with my notion of right and wrong? It's just too much to handle. I mean, what do you think? I mean, could you handle just every scientific wonder and demon that could be hatched out in the future?
I'd have to see it before I'd let you know. I would like to shake you up just a little bit, though, before we depart, that I do think we've done sort of a Western-centric view of things here. You say that our Anglo-Saxon thinks he's in heaven, and he might be if you bring him to the Western world and where we have food on the shelves.
Right,
but
flying around, yeah.
But if you put him in Dresden in 1945, maybe a different result.
Well, that's a good point, isn't it?
Yes.
So the idea of whether history is progressive or cyclical. And that's a good conversation for another time.
Indeed.
But we've assumed
yes.
that everything is going to be great you could say he's going to show up right now in Macon, Georgia, and maybe of all the worlds out there, Macon, Georgia, with its defects in 2016 is close to paradisio for the human experience.
Indeed. Or take somebody from Somalia and put him here, from Somalia in 2016 and bring him to Macon.
Yes.
So, but yeah, as you say, I don't think we can solve that in 1 minute.
And my final comment is maybe that if you took our Anglo-Saxon peasant 1016, and there are lots of places in the world that he could go, and he would recognize the situation. It might not be as psychologically daunting for him in those circumstances.
Benjamin Franklin in ancient Greece.
Yes. Well, on that note, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Sir.
Thank you for being here tonight.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.